CD Projekt Red just gave a big update on their company overall, their direction moving forward, and of course, in this we got a ton of details around the future of Cyberpunk 2077. And it really feels like this is a response or reaction to the pretty disastrous launch of Cyberpunk 2077 and where CD Projekt will be going next, how they're changing things for the future. There's a lot to talk about around this. They go over a lot of details around things like free DLCs as well as paid expansions on the horizon for the development of the Cyberpunk IP, and even some confusing descriptions on multiplayer. We're going to try and clear up what's going on with Cyberpunk multiplayer as we get some pretty big updates here as to what's happening. And this overall really seems to be a much more comprehensive strategy moving forward as a response to the backlash they got around the Cyberpunk launch. And well, things are not completely on the up and up, as following this news and these new announcements going live, CDPR stock did drop another 10% nearly, which is quite disastrous for what is supposed to be their whole big step forward. So this change in strategy by CDPR is pretty interesting, as they're making several changes across several different fronts. They're dubbing it all under this new thing called Red 2.0. It's not a new engine or anything, just a moniker for the strategy overall. Like before, their strategy was Red 1.0, now they're transitioning to Red 2.0. And one of the big things that is going to be changing is they're planning to do parallel AAA game development. The way things worked previously, they were doing development of games one at a time. They worked on The Witcher 3. Once development ended on that game, work began on Cyberpunk 2077. But now going forward, you'll see things like The Witcher 4 development being at the same time as Cyberpunk 2078's development. I know that some aspects of this is beginning already. It really seems like this is going to begin in 2022, and it's going to be made possible by having some engine refinements, having the Red engine apply to both franchises, and they very much so talk about this for both Cyberpunk and The Witcher. It seems like those are the two franchises they're focusing on, but also some of the teams at CDPR will be working on both franchises and kind of switching back and forth as far as development goes. As well as they do have a new CTO who was previously the head of one of their other studios, the one working on Cyberpunk multiplayer. And this actually has the potential to be a particularly big deal. They mentioned a bit later on how they also are planning quite a bit of growth for the company overall, mainly in the form of mergers or acquisitions, one of which was just completed to establish CDPR Vancouver. But if you enjoy Cyberpunk or The Witcher, this seems like it has a realistic possibility to just make it so we have more content from those games. I don't think it necessarily means that The Witcher 4 will be coming a bit sooner, in the sense that we already are completed with Cyberpunk. The Witcher 4 is likely what they're working on next, but more so that in a 5-year time span, perhaps The Witcher 4 comes out and not that long after, just a year or 2 years, we actually do get Cyberpunk 2078 or whatever the next AAA title from them is going to be. The main takeaway being, if you are a fan of CD Projekt Red, it seems like they have plans to put out a lot more content over the next couple of years and really just going forward in general. But one of the other big things that they say they really learned about from the release of Cyberpunk 2077 is they're making big changes on how they market games. They mentioned taking lessons from others in the industry, and really what they mean there is Bethesda, as what CDPR hopes to do is take a Bethesda approach, and specifically kind of what Bethesda is doing with Starfield and the Elder Scrolls 6, or what it seems like they're doing. That is, perhaps have a teaser a bit ahead of time, a teaser just kind of revealing, hey, we're actually working on this game. But then the full-on heavy marketing won't actually come until much closer to the game's actual release. And this isn't only applying to their AAA titles, but they also mention how they're going to be doing this with the expansions for Cyberpunk. So we get basically no new details as far as the actual expansions themselves, and they say they're doing this because they want to talk about them when they're actually closer to release. And for games overall, they plan to show actual game footage in some of those trailers, not far out demos. This likely referring to that 2018 gameplay of Cyberpunk that ended up being quite a bit different than what we got in the game. Many features shown during that are just not in the game at all, as well as actually showing the game on all of the consoles it will release on. This again in reference to Cyberpunk 2077 not being shown on base last-gen consoles. And this is actually a pretty big deal already. During these investor presentations, this was an investor-facing strategy update first and foremost. They do take a Q&A after the fact, and they were a lot more tight-lipped in this one about certain things. In the past, they kind of let it slip that they're working on something The Witcher. They talked about Cyberpunk multiplayer in 2022, but this time around, they were much more tight-lipped, again, even on things just like expansions. Now, whether or not you do like that CDPR is almost transitioning to a Bethesda-like marketing cycle, reveal is kind of going to be your own personal preference. I personally love this because, large in part, when you get that final Bethesda reveal, even though it may take time, like the Starfield one, may not even be until next summer, which leads us to grasping at straws for years at a time. When that big presentation is finally there, when you finally do get Todd Howard coming out on stage, you get extremely hyped because you know this is it, and it's actually it. You are seeing a game that you'll be able to play in under 6 months most of the time, and CDPR doing that is not something I'm really against, and it definitely is a good response or reaction to what happened with Cyberpunk. They could have just gone the route of fixing the game, then kind of doing the exact same thing with all future titles, but instead they are taking a big step in a different direction as far as marketing goes. And that definitely reflects they are realizing and probably feeling it from a financial perspective how they messed up with Cyberpunk, and they very much so don't want to make that same mistake again. They also gave out what they called a 2021 roadmap. I would barely call this a roadmap. It basically lays out what their goal is for 2021, that being patches and updates for Cyberpunk, so fixing the problems, then some free DLC for Cyberpunk, then in the second half of this year, the next gen upgrade for Cyberpunk. We do get confirmation later on that the expansions for Cyberpunk 2077 are already in progress, and it really does seem like they are coming in 2022, but they don't want to specify anything. So somebody asked, is it possible these could come in late 2021, and they wouldn't clarify. So maybe right at the end of the year, but it definitely seems pretty likely these paid Cyberpunk expansions are next year, but they're already being developed. They mentioned some other things, wanting to extend their franchises outside of just the core game, this in both merch as well as additional methods of media like TV shows, movies, etc. Not a ton of new details on this, just kind of something they want to do going forward. But then we get to the talk about the online components of these games, which is another core part of their long-term strategy for both The Witcher and Cyberpunk, and seemingly all franchises going forward. They want to implement online aspects to these games in a natural way while maintaining games as single-player RPGs first and foremost, but they also do say they have reconsidered their next AAA title being the multiplayer aspect of Cyberpunk. This was always a confusing one. The way they referenced the multiplayer for Cyberpunk was basically it would be a separate, totally free game, like there'd be Cyberpunk 2077, and then separately for free, the multiplayer as a standalone AAA development. And it seems like that is no longer going to be a thing, and there's a lot of confusion around this. At first glance, that makes it seem like, okay, the multiplayer for Cyberpunk was scrapped, but in reality, what I think is going on here is it's just kind of gotten transitioned to a more permanent part of CD Projekt Red in general. They talk about how they have plans to be able to bring online to all franchises and technology that can bring it in a more seamless way, not devoting a bunch of time to a dedicated AAA online game, that with Cyberpunk multiplayer. And they further say, we do have strong ideas and prototypes actually. We began work on online components over 2 years ago when we're continuing. The only change is that we continue to work on it as not the main production line, but as a supporting production line, together with our single-player productions. So I think the way they announced this or revealed this is actually super confusing and kind of done in not the best way, because what it seems like to me is going on is previously their plans were to release Cyberpunk 2077, then work on Cyberpunk 2077 multiplayer or just Cyberpunk multiplayer, and in their pipeline, this was very much so viewed as a next AAA title. They worked on Cyberpunk, then they would work on multiplayer, then they would probably work on The Witcher 4 after Cyberpunk multiplayer. Now, instead, things kind of got reorganized. They're going to be supporting Cyberpunk, and then, starting in 2022, also working on The Witcher 4, and also working on Cyberpunk multiplayer. Except now, not only will the team be working on a Cyberpunk multiplayer, but they're just going to always have a team dedicated to creating online aspects for their games. It's almost as if they have now just a studio and a subgroup of people at CD Projekt Red that will always work on multiplayer stuff that's separate from the single player teams. So although you've probably seen those articles how CDPR seemingly canceled the multiplayer for Cyberpunk, it's not really that. It's they canceled working on that as like a AAA title that they put all their devs on. During the Q&A, they quite literally say, we are not less ambitious in terms of online, it's just a different way of getting there, more step by step and less like releasing a single player game. They describe doing this in a step-by-step fashion, how we're working on specific features, enhancing our single player, but we are not working on releasing the next game as a big online experience. They want to enhance single player games with online experiences. is. But they do explicitly mean multiplayer in people playing together. They say that. It's not like it's just going to be some kind of social connection. And they are not any less ambitious in terms of what they hope to bring with this multiplayer mode. It's not like the scope of it was shrunken, but rather their plan for how to get there is going to be more gradual. It seems like it almost feels like they're doing multiplayer as an early access thing. Like you'll get the multiplayer functionality first, then they'll start adding on game modes and additional features over time. It won't just be one big release, but rather a gradual process of implementing them into their AAA games. So in some ways, to me, this actually seems like, one, we'll be seeing Cyberpunk multiplayer even sooner than we would have previously, and two, CDPR is investing in multiplayer permanently as a long-term solution. A lot of people make comparisons between Cyberpunk multiplayer and GTA Online, and I think this is kind of their goal or the money they're looking at here. And that's why I think the way they actually handled this reveal or announcement was quite poorly done and is likely a big consideration when it comes to their stock price dropping 9%, which is huge, especially for a company like CD Projekt Red, who already saw their stock dropping by quite a bit over the past couple of months, and then an extra 9% on top of that is big. But during the actual strategy itself, they mentioned having reconsidered their next AAA being the multiplayer aspect of Cyberpunk. But during the Q&A, they basically describe how it's not that they're scaling down the fact that Cyberpunk is getting multiplayer, but rather it's not going to be a AAA team on that. They're going to gradually, over time, implement the multiplayer features to the game, and they will be permanently implementing multiplayer features into all of their future titles with a separate aspect of their organization always working on that. As far as stuff like the PlayStation Store, they had no major updates on that, although they do describe how we believe it may also influence the purchase decisions of not only those who play on PlayStation, but also on other platforms. So Cyberpunk's return to the PlayStation Store would be a big deal for the game overall, as it would kind of be a sign of confidence by Sony that, okay, this is playable now, and in turn, many other gamers may pick up the game as a result. And then one final quote I do want to read off is, "We have definitely learned from the Cyberpunk launch. Among those lessons is that projects shouldn't be announced and promoted too early, and that we shouldn't build expectations before we are ready. For future releases, we plan later initiation of marketing campaigns, and we also prefer for upcoming projects and annual cycles. This is why we have covered the current year in detail, that being the roadmap. But as for longer term concerns, as we've mentioned, we plan to reorganize this studio, learn new ways of developing games, be more agile, and when the time comes, announce the release dates and provide more guidance than we can reasonably give today." And it really seems like overall, this is a before and after point for CD Projekt Red. Cyberpunk and the ensuing backlash has led to them making significant changes to the company overall, and even further, significant changes to their strategy going forward. This is a company that previously was actually quite readily announcing or mentioning aspects of future titles ahead of time, and now it seems like that is completely cut off. We'll probably get one teaser a year out of launch, and then the actual marketing campaign months before launch. I'll be curious to see what impact this has on the expansions, but it definitely seems like an exciting next step for this company. Of course, right now it's just a lot of words. We have to see what they actually do next. With that said, hopefully you guys found this one informative. It definitely is pretty interesting to see where things are going. And until next time, I thank you all again for watching. I hope to see you all later.